This evening, I am going to read a bit from my book, Pride of Family. I was very pleased to hear that there were some people who had just read the book, and that was very, very nice. I'm going to read a little bit from this book, and I'm going to read from my other book of poems and texts called Nile Night afterwards. It's called Nile Night, Remembered Texts from the Deep, and it's related to many Egyptian journeys that I've taken. So I'll take you on a little journey to Egypt. First, I'll take you on a journey, the beginning of a journey that I took in creating this memoir. I'm going to read the preface because that tells so much about it. Pride of Family, 4 generations of American women of color. The truth is, I knew I was female before I knew I was black. I was raised by 3 singular women, my mother, my grandmother, and my great aunt. And all my life I studied them. Their smooth faces, the enigma of their bodies, strong, proud, secretive, like the mythic beings in my storybooks. The women in my family presented themselves to me fully formed and without much history to speak of. They were simply there with their hankies and hairpins, high heels and furs, perfumes and pianos, racing sheets and stethoscopes. My gambling grandmother was a high-kicking dancer in the great chorus lines of the 20s and 30s, and she loved to play the numbers and bet the horses. My dignified great aunt was a medical doctor and a social reformer. And my mother was a journalist and a writer of murder mysteries, who also composed tropical songs. I hoped that one day I would be like these women, that they would accept me as one of them, that I would bask in their love and understanding, and would share in all of their secrets. There were, of course, men in the family, too. We saw them every few months, or in times of relative truce, more often. When they were not around, they were spoken of with pursed-lipped exasperation. Yet, I could often detect traces of reluctant admiration in the women's voices. The men in the family had made their mark. There was my father, a sociologist, and my grandfather, a respected actor, whose father was a Reconstruction-era judge. My great-grandfather's uncle was a 19th century moralist, lumber merchant, abolitionist, and publisher from Philadelphia, whose life I could read about in history books. I was raised to be proud of the accomplishments of our family, to feel that we had a special place in the world. As I grew older, however, I began to notice something I'd been hiding, even from myself. Underneath the pride, I sometimes felt ashamed and afraid. Each of the women who had raised me had passed on certain rules about living. Always have some money of your own. You can't trust a man. Always put cold cream on your face at night. A woman never tells her age. Be vague about dates. But I started to realize that there was something essential they weren't telling me. Some reason why it was so difficult for us to feel at home with one another and with our lives. I was a rebel daughter, not knowing that my mother and my grandmother had each before me also been a rebel daughter. Home for us as Black women was never simple. In the distant past, our ancestors had held allegiance to lands as disparate as Europe and Africa, pre-colonized America, and the island of Hispaniola. And in the United States, as if to echo the diaspora of our ancestors, home for us has consisted of different houses in different cities. Individually, we each traveled to distant places on a quest for home. My mother to Mexico, my grandmother on the vaudeville circuit, I to France, Spain, California. Our foremothers had also struggled to feel at home in the world, but I didn't know this. Like most Americans, I had little concept of history and connection with my family. No idea how recently, in fact, we had become Americans. I knew very little about the three women I grew up with, and less about the women who came before them. In our family, the men's lives were well documented, but the women's were shrouded in mystery. In 1973, I was struggling to balance marriage, motherhood, and a writing career in New York City. I had 3 small boys, and it was a hopeful time. Women and Black writers were coming to the forefront, and inspired by the women's movement, I decided to write an article for Ms. magazine about the women in my family. I remembered that my mother had once mentioned a diary written by her grandmother, Frances Ann Rollin, whom she had described as an ancestor, a terrific woman, a writer. I wrote to her and asked her to send it. From the moment I read the words Frances Ann Rollin wrote in Boston on January 1st, 1868, the year renews its birth today, with all of its hopes and sorrows. She became my beacon, the foremother who would finally share with me our collective past. Born into a free family of color before the Civil War, my great-grandmother was an abolitionist and a feminist. She wrote about issues of race, class, and womanhood over 100 years before me. I was enthralled, but I was also puzzled. Why hadn't my mother told me about her while I was growing up? This question, with many others, sparked a search that went on for 2 decades. My children grew up during this time, and so did I. I came to understand that it was the pride of family that kept secrets and told lies, the pride that told of the men and not the women, the fair-skinned and not the dark, the privileged and not the poor, which had kept me from home. So that's the preface to the book. I'll give you a little touch of the diary. So I did send for the diary. I discovered my great-grandmother was a wonderful writer from Charleston, South Carolina, a place I had never been at that time. And everything that I discovered was new, so new to me, and nothing. So I had to become an historian in order to complete this book. The little package arrived at my loft by mail, landing in the middle of my strained marriage, in the middle of my life of mothering and writing. It was covered by a small piece of protective cardboard, and I left it intact on my desk all that day, waiting for undisturbed time to look at it. That night, once my children were asleep, I took the diary to a comfortable corner of the loft and knelt on the creaky floorboards. I could hear the dull drone of our whizzing cars past in a mechanical ocean of sound overhead as the children slept peacefully. The diary's fine brown leather binding was worn by age, and the light of my small lamp played on pages that were covered with a faint, elegant script. I couldn't make out the handwriting at first. On the title page, the words "Illuminated Diary" for 1868 were printed in an ornate scroll, and underneath, a delicately drawn schooner. Sails full, traveled neatly circumscribed waves. I quickly scanned the information at the beginning of the book. Already I could feel myself sinking into the time of the diary. I took a deep breath. January 1, Boston, Mass.